Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring UFO phenomena from the point of view of archetypal and symbolic analysis. With me in the studio is Keith Thompson, an independent researcher and writer and author of Angels and Aliens, UFOs and the Mythic Imagination. Welcome, Keith.
Hello, Jeffrey.
Great to be with you.
Thank you.
Let's begin by distinguishing the archetypal or symbolic approach to understanding UFOs from other approaches that are conventionally used, if you can think of any approach to UFOs as being conventional.
Well, by symbolic or archetypal, what I'm particularly interested in is symbolic, by symbolic. A phenomenon is symbolic when it means more than it says on its surface. And I wanted to try to document the extent to which, and I'm interested in the extent to which, the UFO phenomenon has taken on this host of associations, religious, mythological, political, and yet it is not reducible to any one of these. Even though all of these elements are there, it has taken on these associations, and it evokes, the very idea of UFOs evokes a very deep response, both from those who believe they're real and those who are against the very idea that they're real. Both groups tend to have a very strong charge, and I wanted to explore that.
In other words, you seem to be saying that whether or not there's actual hardware visiting us from outer space, that UFOs are realer than real in terms of their cultural impact upon us.
Exactly. I mean, what I wanted to document in my book and what Angels and Aliens and what continues to interest me is how 40 years after the phrase flying saucer came into the collective imagination, the UFO idea has entered very deeply into popular mythology through our movies, our films, our dreams, our nightmares, our hopes, and they're generated effects that have been very deep, very broad, so that what has emerged is a phenomenon that has almost religious implications. And by that I mean, I was told when I began to study this phenomenon that I needed to be prepared to meet a lot of true believers, that I would, and by that I assumed, I expected that people need for UFOs to be real. I'm going to meet some people who need for them to be real. That's what we generally have in mind when we think of the true believer. But what amazed me was that the true believers I didn't expect to find, and in fact maybe the strongest true believers, are the debunkers. That is, the ones who aren't true skeptics. By skeptic, skeptic says there may be something real, let's look at the evidence, I've got an open mind, and so forth. The debunkers are almost committed to the idea that UFOs can't be real because they don't fit our conventional models. So they're as interested in debunking, getting rid of UFO reports just as much as we typically think certain people need for UFOs to be real.
Debunkers often seem to use the phrase, there isn't a shred of evidence, as if they've counted all the shreds that, that might exist. Well, if you look at it, I guess from a mythological point of view, it's like there's this great battle between people who are absolutely horrified at the prospect that there might be any reality, and other people who are horrified that someone else is trying to deny what they seem to feel is clear as day.
Exactly. Well, I use the word myth in my approach in a couple of different ways, because myth is multifaceted, myth is multidimensional. There is no single definition of myth. One, of course, is the sense in which there have been figures in mythology, there have been events that have been described in the mythologies of the world involving abductions, involving extraordinary encounters with extraordinary beings, creatures. So in that sense, there are echoes of that in the UFO phenomenon. I mean, what do we have but encounters with extraordinary beings from somewhere? But there's an even more basic sense in which I'm interested in UFOs as myth. And that is, the word myth in a Greek sense is from mythos, meaning plot. And that's what you've touched on. There's an extraordinary plot here. That is, something is seen in the sky. These celestial events that land on the ground, that contain, these craft contain these extraordinary creatures. And then that's when the debate starts. The proponents say, well, yes, it's real because there are a lot of sightings throughout the world. The debunkers say, no, it's not real. It can be explained in terms of hoax, hallucination, and misidentification. And there is this epic mythic battle, this plot develops with each UFO case. And that's what I wanted to try to document, is how this phenomenon, with its kind of intrinsic ambiguities, its ability to appear in some cases as material events, physical events, others as psychic events, the very doubleness of the phenomenon seems to increase the impulse to make it black or white among the players. Either it can't be real or it must be real.
But you know, I get the feeling that you're saying something even deeper than that. It's not as if you're just standing at a distance looking at these players battling over the evidence for UFOs and how it's impacted upon culture. That there's also a small group of players, and I think I would identify you among them at this point, who are saying that the mythic approach, the archetypal approach, is a whole other way to see the phenomenon. And it has real implications for the nature of reality itself and the reality of the phenomenon.
I'm typically asked, are UFOs real? You know, when I've been on other programs, that's the major question that gets us, are they real or not? And I say yes. My own study of it says yes. And then from there I ask a question in return, which is, now what is reality? Because by the very appearance, the very way these phenomena manifest, over time, in various cultures, with various credible witnesses from different walks of life, what we have is a phenomenon that is at once able to appear as a physical phenomenon, and to then to disappear, to retreat, to change shape on the spot. In other words, it really does call into question our viewpoint about reality. You know, our physics. It transcends our physics. It transcends the idea that physics and psychology, there must be a huge gulf between. It really calls into question, this phenomenon calls into question really all of our sharp dichotomies about even what is real versus mythic, the idea that these must be different. But the phenomenon, I think, in some sense is teasing apart those kinds of distinctions.
One of the most unique insights that I think you've come up with is the analogy between the UFO phenomenon and the Greek god Proteus. I wonder if you could amplify on that.
Exactly. The Greek god Proteus was known for his ability to change shape and form and to evade all of his questioners thereby. And he would appear as the ocean, appear as water, and assume all sorts of variable shapes. And you could ask Proteus questions, and he would always give an answer, a partial answer, would give an answer to the specific question, and so forth. And in that sense, the UFO is like Proteus. I mean, I've kind of defined in my own research and my own writing about this, I see the UFO as a protagonist of this great drama. And this protagonist has the ability to be whatever anyone wants it to be. The debunkers, for example, can look at a set of cases, UFO cases, and dismiss the cases and say that there's nothing going on here. So they are asking of the UFO phenomenon, are you real? And they get the answer, no. The proponents look at those same UFO cases and say, are you real? And they get the answer, yes. In other words, because there's an intrinsic protean shape-shifting ability in this phenomenon, and all of the levels it seems to occupy, is that each side looking for its black or white, yes or no answer can get the information they want without, by any means, exhausting all of the potential symbolic possibilities. In other words, the UFO phenomenon retains a depth and a complexity larger than all the attempts to corner it. And in that sense, it's like Proteus escaping all of his questioners.
It's as if you're saying the proponents, the true believers, or the people who are seriously researching the idea that we're being visited by extraterrestrial craft, and the debunkers and the skeptics and the people in that spectrum are looking at the phenomenon from the lens of what you might call a modern or a postmodern viewpoint. They're not examining all the potential hypotheses. And by bringing into play the idea of the ancient Greek myth of the god Proteus, I think you're saying something much larger than, well, this is just a myth. You're suggesting that myths have a larger life of their own that we must begin to take into account.
Exactly, and in that sense, there's what I think the part of the phenomenon that resonates with that is the sense in which this phenomenon is autonomous. Now, it comes and goes at its will, with impunity. I think, for example, what 40 years later, the standard complaint of UFO proponents is, or the prediction of UFO proponents, any day now the lid on the government cover-up is going to blow sky high. And we've been hearing this for 40 years, and that has a kind of ritualistic necessity in the myth that helps keep the faithful interested and so forth. But the very idea that the government has all of the answers well, it's a curious idea at this point in our culture. But I think more likely what's being covered up or ignored is the fact that the Air Force doesn't have control over this phenomenon. They not only don't understand it, but since the Air Force is in charge of the skies, they have to be able to explain and be able to reassure us that things are okay in the skies. But in fact, the reports about this phenomenon indicate that this phenomenon does come and go. It has a larger life of its own. What exactly the implications of that are, I mean, we can speculate in an unbounded way, but nevertheless, there is a larger life to this whole drama, larger than it is typically discussed in the simplistic yes or no, real or mythic, real or symbolic choice that we typically get. Even that, I guess what I'm trying to say is, even that tendency to make it either or, yes or no, that is worth studying. In other words, that's what I'm interested in studying. There's the UFO itself, then there's the witness to the UFO, then in the next orbit out are the proponents versus the debunkers, and then the next orbit out is the news media, the military, scientific observers, journalists, and so forth. And all of this is the UFO phenomenon. All of it is a modern display of our life and our times. And that's what I've tried to focus on, is how the phenomenon evokes very deep responses.
Well, you're suggesting, though, that the idea of a polarity, either something exists or it doesn't exist, that the very logic behind that kind of thinking, you're calling that logic into question, and that's a very widely accepted kind of logic. What alternative do you propose?
Well, in asking, whether the phenomenon is real, the question of, let me kind of make a comparison. In the 19th century, there were fiery rocks falling from the sky in Europe and the United States, and they had the unfortunate fate of being seen by untrained observers, common people, workers in the fields, and they were reassured by the scientific minds of the time that there were no such phenomena happening.
Right.
And it turned out there were. They ended up being called meteors.
Yes, I recall Thomas Jefferson said he'd sooner believe that Yankee professors would lie than that stones would fall from the heavens.
Exactly, and he was a great man of the Enlightenment, and yet in his own he was, in effect, a kind of debunker. That's too strong a term because he was not obsessed with the idea that meteors couldn't be real, I don't think, but he simply, it didn't fit. Likewise, in our age, Carl Sagan and other, spokesmen for mainstream science have, on the one hand, love the idea and wax eloquent about the idea of life, in the possibility of life, and the probability that there's life in other places. But the idea that it could be represented by these grotesque reports of flying saucers, Sagan ridicules that. And there's a parallel there, that there's something that's appearing in the minds and the eyes and in the lives of ordinary people, and yet by its very characteristics, it's not admissible. And therefore, in being dismissed at a surface level, these reports continue to be absorbed throughout the culture and around the world, and so they have a life of their own that's deeper than the real or not. I mean, officially, people say, ask me, are UFOs real? And I say yes and no. No, they're not, officially. And officially, they do not exist. But yes, of course they're real. They have a life of their own. They're reported throughout the world. So they have a de facto
And some
reality.
governments say officially they do exist.
Exactly.
Our government hasn't gone that far, but others have.
The Belgian government has. They've not only, they're one of the few governments that's not only scrambled jets, but they've admitted and talked about where they sent the jets. And so, which adds more drama, because that's the first government to kind of cross the line and say that there is something. So, and then, of course, one of the most interesting metaphors is the whole idea of contact, and the idea of contact coming soon. There's an imminent contact. The very idea of contact prepares us for something, some arrival, some meeting, some encounter. And what I've been interested in, what I've tried to define in my own research, is the richness of that term. Are we also meeting some parts of ourselves? Is there some evolutionary unfoldment implicit in all this? Are we coming ashore to some larger part of reality? Is some part of reality that's always been there, slowly making itself seen? And I use the metaphor of the flying saucer as a bobber. You know, the fish from below sees bobbers and reports them to the other fish and so forth. But above the bobber is this other world of air and forms that most fish don't see. And I have a sense that people who are reporting UFOs, and especially the people who have been abducted, whatever that really is in that encounter, these people are sort of, in an own way, they are seers. They are seeing some new dimension.
Well, you push the analogy much farther too. You suggest that as fish evolved into amphibians and discovered a whole new life, there may be other realms of existence waiting for us that with our current sensory equipment, we just don't quite grasp yet.
And that's where this whole discussion really opens up. I mean, I think that the future of UFO research is going to be quite exciting because in contrast to mainstream ufology, and ufology is the term that the field has given to itself, you know, gives it a certain kind of legitimacy and coherence. The mainstream ufology tends to be conservative. They have a conservative view of physics and of sort of mainstream reality. So their job, difficult job, is to keep squashing all of these rich phenomena into the conventional model of reality. In contrast to which, there's another possibility, which is to look at the new physics. There are the new physicists, quantum physicists, theoretical physicists, who are positing a many-dimensional universe. Some say there are 20 dimensions, some say there are 50, some say there are 70. But already the speculation in the mainstream of science, to some extent, is ahead of the ufology field, which tends to be way back here. So if reality has many more dimensions than we think, then it may not be necessary or even correct to look to, quote, outer space for an answer, even though our movies the past 40 years have given us that as the primary possibility. It may be rather that UFOs are somehow embedded right here in a reality that is more complex and complicated. And the interesting thing is we're involved in that reality too. So that is to say, we may be meeting these UFOs, these aliens, on a kind of common ground that we don't even realize. In other words, we may be amphibians. There's human nature being complex and multidimensional. We are amphibians meeting other amphibians, and maybe we're going to play on some common ground.
Sounds like the famous quote of Pogo, "We have found the enemy and he is us."
Right, right, because the very idea that the abductees, these abductions are remarkable, whatever is exactly going on. They tend to be repeat cases. People who have abductions tend to report that they've had them throughout their life.
A history of them, yes.
So, and one of the characteristics of these abductions is that people tend to be paralyzed during the encounter, during the procedure. And I've speculated that what if we human beings were trained to recognize that we are multiple in that we have capacities in our nature, paranormal capacities, which actually there's a lot of evidence in the religious traditions of stigmata. To say the least, there's a lot of evidence of paranormal phenomena here in the human realm. We could specify
vast amounts of research that have been done. Everything from out-of-body experiences to near-death experiences. To
bilocation, the idea of someone seemingly appearing in two places at once, or at least their psychic double. Now, if people are able to do that unknowingly, and usually unwittingly, what if we would train in our schools, in our education, to open up to those possibilities? Then, in other words, are we and the aliens already together part of some hyper-dimensional, many-dimensional reality that we are already part of? And what the UFOs are slowly doing, unknowingly, while we're having this debate, are they real or not, what's slowly happening is more and more people are having these encounters, and it's as if the phenomenon is slowly beckoning us toward it, even though it does it in disguised form, because we're debating about whether they're real. Meanwhile, there's these encounters continue, and unbeknownst to us, there is contact.
Yeah. You've suggested that Jacques Vallée, one of the major researchers in the field, points out that the phenomenon itself, for all of its ambiguities, may be functioning as some sort of a reinforcement system, that it's attempting to shape our behavior and to teach us about it in very unconscious ways.
Exactly, and he uses the metaphor of behavioral conditioning, and most behavioral conditioning involves periods of intense conditioning followed by lapses. It's called periodicity. If the conditioning were constant, then we wouldn't see the learning effect. It wouldn't be the same. But whereas there are periods of intense UFO activity, and then there are dry periods, and then there are sudden upsurges and so forth, and he has made the really remarkable connection between, he was one of the first, actually Carl Jung was the first to come into the field, and then Vallée, to look at the parallels between modern UFO encounters and ancient angelic encounters with poltergeist, in other words, encounters with all variety of supernormal, supernatural creatures. Tried to look for parallels, and he believes what we've got here is a larger meta phenomenon that gives particular cultures itself, gives particular phenomena in forms that they can absorb.
Well, and if you look at the various myths and traditions that have to do with the founding of the great religions, they all have phenomenon supposedly witnessed by many people that are often very much resonant with the UFO. I mean, like the Ten Commandments given on Mount Sinai, or the various apparitions and appearances of the Virgin Mary.
Which are on an increase throughout the world now. And Ezekiel, what did Ezekiel really see? What was Ezekiel trying to describe in his language then, according to his images? Some people say he saw a flying saucer, but see, that begs the question. I mean, but nevertheless, he saw something extraordinary and tried to render it. And there have been, as you say, this relationship between miracles, miraculous, quote-unquote miracles, and the founding of religions. The Mormon religion, Joseph Smith was guided by what he called an angel, repeated encounters with an angel. So are we now seeing, in the form of these abductions and other kinds of UFO encounters, are these prophecies, are these encounters, are these miracles becoming widespread? In other words, once it was a selected prophet. Now it's almost as if that many people are having, many people are having almost shamanic, many people, each person who has this encounter describes it, or many of them describe it in terms very similar to what shamans have reported. So is there something widespread, is there something widely distributed in the culture now emerging in the guise of UFOs?
In other words, it seems to be suggesting that we can't really get a good handle on the nature of UFOs until we understand ourselves better.
Well, that's my conclusion, is that 40 years after the phrase flying saucer was invented, as we've had a very, we, meaning those who have been engaged in this discussion, having a firm debate about what they're made of and where they're from, we're secretly having another debate. Implicit in that debate is a debate about who we are and where we're from. Because as we try to place UFOs, try to find their place in reality, we're also implicitly placing ourselves, and we do that covertly. In other words, so the debate about what they are is also a debate about who we are, and it's an indirect debate, and that's the kind of things I'm trying to tease out in my own speculations.
Well, you have suggested that it would be very interesting if people who were UFO contactees, and I think you would also include UFO researchers, if they were to study the disciplines of shamanism and meditation and the martial arts and yoga, and these disciplines seem to claim in their own folklore and tradition to equip us to operate in more than just the normal three dimensions, that we learn to function with new energies, chi energy and prana, and work in the spirit planes. And if people who had these skills began doing UFO investigations, we might in effect develop a breakthrough in our approach.
Well, it's a kind of a tragedy that ufology, that this phenomenon has been left to this improvised field called ufology. And that's not to criticize the field, it's to say that we ought to have philosophers, we ought to have religious scholars. The encounters that people report, these abductions, bear striking similarities to the material that St. John of the Cross defined in his book, The Dark Night of the Soul. These are primordial religious experiences in the deepest sense, primary religious encounters. It's what religions, as you say, are founded on. And yet it's being left to hobbyists. And again, I don't mean that with criticism toward the people in the field, but where are philosophers, where are the mystics, where are language analysts, where are the journalists, to say, here we have a very rich, complex, multidimensional phenomenon that needs a multidisciplinary approach, which I've tried to help bring to it, and a few others, several others now, And that excites me because it's as if the more we give to the phenomenon in terms of our inquiry, the more we're going to get back.
Mm-hmm. I guess we ought not to neglect the approach that certain fundamental Christian scholars and preachers have taken, that these are satanic objects, that also are satanic apparitions, I think is the phrase they use. That adds to the folklore as well and to the fear.
There's actually a small but very vocal literature among fundamentalist Christians
mm-hmm.
about UFOs as satanic, UFOs as demonic, and you know there's a certain truth to that.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, there are parallels between the UFO, various kinds of UFO phenomena, various kinds of encounters, and demonic,
mm-hmm.
quote, demonic phenomena, and angelic phenomena, the idea of there being intermediate realms of reality. And in a sense, the Christian fundamentalists are onto something
mm-hmm.
by saying, this is about more than spaceships, folks.
Yeah.
And but we tend to miss that by our sort of modern blinders that,
mm-hmm.
that tend to dismiss Christian and religious experiences in general.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems to me that if we look at this from a cultural point of view, our ability to understand something as subtle and as complex as UFOs is limited by our evolution as a culture and as a species. I would think. We hardly begun to grasp with such fundamental things as the nature of the mind and the powers of the human body. How can we really get a handle on the possibility of visitors from alien dimensions or from outer space?
Wherever those dimensions are. Yeah, there are two analogies I'll give you. One is of a frog. A frog in its eyes has a few nerve endings,
mm-hmm.
and it sees, in effect, a gray, indistinct mass.
Yeah.
It sees very little subtlety, but it sees enough to catch flies and to avoid predators most of the time.
Got just about a minute.
Okay. In any event, likewise, just like the frog sees according to its structure, we see according to our structure
mm-hmm.
in the broadest sense, our cognitive, spiritual, psychological structure. It may be that this phenomenon does occupy more dimensions.
Right.
So slowly it's going to require study of states of consciousness,
mm-hmm.
and slowly we may be opening to it, but it may be a very long arc.
In other words, our understanding of this complex phenomenon may not be much more evolved than a frog sticking his tongue out and trying to catch a fly.
That's right, and the frog
mm-hmm.
succeeds in catching flies, and that's about it. And we do what we do, and we may be slowly opening to larger realms, but in a very, very long kind of arc.
Yeah. Keith Thompson, it's been a pleasure having you share what I regard as one of the most sophisticated approaches to this phenomenon. Thanks so much for being with me.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's been great being here.
And thank you for being with us.